Good afternoon, everybody. It's very good to be here. I feel quite honoured to have been invited to do this talk. Hopefully, by the end of it, you'll have a little bit more awareness and understanding of which unions you could be in England, and indeed which unions can do the best for you and how they go about doing it. My name is Chris Jones. I've been a Unite activist for the last 10 or 12 years. I'll mention that union more later. But over the last 40 odd years, I've been a member of the Shop Workers Union USDOR, the Railway Workers Union, the RMT, the Public Sector Union Unison, and like I said, I'm now a member of Unite, which is the biggest union in the country. What I'd like to do is describe the different types of unions that are available for you to join, and then to outline a little bit of how they work and the different legal and other rights that unions have and that they can frequently enforce on your behalf. It's not straightforward, but I'll make it as straightforward as I can, and let's see how it works out. First of all, I'd like to say that there are three basic types of union in this country. There are very industry-specific unions, such as the RMT, Railway, Maritime and Transport Union, which is heavily concentrated in the railway system, though it does have people who work on merchant ships. There's USDOR, which is focused union, shop, distributive and allied workers, which is focused mainly, as you can say from the name, by people who work in retail. There's the Bakers Union, which mainly does people in the baking industry, but also a little bit wider in the food industry. And there are unions like the PCS, which is for the Public and Civil Service Union, and the University and College Union, which mainly deals with lecturers, teaching assistants, and so on in the further education section. So they are specific unions. But there are also two or three very big general unions. I mentioned Unite, which is my union. This union has over 1 million members in this country, and it organises literally in any industry whatsoever. It organises in shipbuilding and engineering. It organises in the care homes and the housing sector and the charity sector. It organises in the retail sector, in its services sector department. And basically you can be in Unite in any industry in the country. There's another general union, the General Municipal and Boilermakers Union, which is now also has people in all the different industries. The third type of union, and it's a very new development in this country, is small, independent, frequently very radical and activist unions, such as United Voices of the World. They tend to organise in parts of the economy where the traditional and older unions haven't organised, and they tend to take quite a militant and determined attitude towards the management. They frequently organise strikes, and most of their members tend to be people who are not from, if you like, the indigenous community of Britain, people who are more recently arrived here as migrants and tend to be treated very badly, tend to be treated as second-class citizens within the employment sector. They also organise in areas where the unions have never organised because the sectors are very new within the economy, such as, for example, bicycle delivery workers who deliver the food that you order from the food shops. And they're very new, they're very small. Right, those are the three types of unions, and maybe we can take specific questions about where you work later on. But certainly you will have choices to make, possibly anyway. The best option is not necessarily the biggest union. The best option is the union that is already organising in your place of work or your type of work or the type of work that you're doing in your area, and it does vary. So in Manchester, where I am, my union branch organises care workers, housing workers and charity workers, but a lot of those workers in the same industry and sometimes even in the same workplaces are in the union called Unison, which traditionally organised in local government and hospitals, but also does have workers in housing and care. So it's not straightforward, and it does involve maybe doing a little bit of local research. The second thing I want to do is to talk about the kind of services that they can provide. Often this depends on whether or not a union is recognised by the employer as a collective bargaining agreement, as it is called. And this means the union has agreed setups and structures for negotiating with the management. They have procedures for dealing with grievances when employees are not happy with the way they're being treated. Unions have the right to represent you if you're being disciplined by your manager, so you don't go in and see your manager alone, you go and see your manager while accompanied by a union representative who will normally, 99% of the time, have received training in your legal rights and how to argue on your behalf with somebody who might be disciplining you. Now, a lot of these rights are supported by law. There is laws against unfair dismissal, racial discrimination, and things of that matter. That can be a very time-consuming process, and historically, though it has produced some great victories in support of workers' rights to the legal system, is often not successful. But there is a legal system. Now, one of the things that maybe we'll touch on a little bit later is the complicated history that's arrived in this put us into this situation, and that is something that has been changing. You might have seen protests recently under the name of the Kill the Bill. There is laws coming in which restrict the right to protest, to picket, to move around, and so on. These are rights which trade unions have used to fight in the past. So these laws are posing a threat. Also, many employers are seeking to get rid of the unions in their workplaces, and that's made it a lot harder to enforce the rights that we do have in the workplace. Ultimately, the strength of the union lies in there being a lot of members in the workplace and not just undercut by the law. And that law is under threat all the time, and particularly with this current government, something that the unions have to be very, very careful and on the ball about to hang on to the rights that we have. In your workplace, you are legally entitled to a health and safety representative, and I think that was dealt with in another talk. But health and safety representatives are people who have a lot of legal rights, and they can, enforce action against the employer or put on legal records that actions could be taken against the employer against faults and dangers that exist within the situation. A little bit of background, because I gather for you it's unusual or you're not familiar with the fact that unions can have such legal strengths. This goes back a long time, and I don't know whether this has been addressed. Something like 120 years ago, there was an enormous strike wave in the historical period that you will know was leading up in the early 20th century towards both the First World War and events such as the Russian Revolution and the collapse of the monarchies in Europe. There was a massive strike wave in Britain as trade unions became organised, but they were frequently not recognised by their employer, and the law normally stood against them. At the same time as this strike wave was developing, the trade unions created the Labour Party in cooperation with a number of small socialist organisations. That was specifically formed to make sure that the laws that restricted trade unions and made them quite ineffective were withdrawn, and effectively won the right to legalised independent trade unions within the country. This strike wave went into abeyance after some very harsh conflicts took place, which saw one of the rare occasions of soldiers being used against strikers in South Wales, and saw Winston Churchill send warships to the River Mersey to point their guns at the city of Liverpool, where the dock workers were on strike, supported by many other workers at that time. The Second World War was mainly very quiet in terms of industrial disputes, but there were so many tenants' conflicts about rents in the Glasgow area, and the behaviour of a lot of employers was seriously resisted. After this, the First World War, the conflicts resumed, and most importantly, the railway union, the road transport union, and the miners' union formed the Triple Alliance, saying that if they were ever attacked by the government again, they would cooperate to resist that attack. This resulted in a general strike in 1926, and though that was not successful, and indeed the miners went down to a very big defeat at that time, and the 1930s were not an easy time for the trade union movement as the recession struck in after the collapse of the Wall Street trading market. Unions continued to develop strength. There were a couple of very short Labour governments, but by the time of the Second World War, the unions had become institutionalised into the British political system. And between the 1940s and the 1970s, unions were involved at all levels of government. The Trade Union Congress, the annual Congress of all the trade unions together, was covered live on the television, and everybody could watch the debates going on. So you had a level of institutionalisation, legalisation, which result in everything from health and safety legislation to anti-racist legislation, to the Sex Equality Acts in terms of equal pay for women, and all those developed alongside so things as wages councils, where the trade unions, the government and the employers agreed minimum wage rates. These were times, though, of a lot of internal conflict within the trade unions, because many people thought the way the unions had been institutionalised into the government and the governing structures meant that they didn't fight as hard as they could for workers' rights. And a lot of very radical, militant, rank-and-file trade union movements developed at that time, which fought for a more militant stance, and indeed there was a growing wave of strikes again from the very end of the 1960s through the 1970s and well into the 80s. However, at that time, a number of major defeats, particularly of the miners in the strike from 1984 to 1985, enabled the Tory government to again start attacking trade union rights. This has resulted in the trade unions being a lot weaker these days than they have been for a very long time. Once upon a time, half the workforce was in the trade unions. Now it's probably 20 or 25%, very heavily concentrated in big manufacturing and the public services, health, local government, national government, and so on and so forth. This situation hopefully is beginning to change. We are seeing more people joining unions, we're seeing more people becoming active in the unions, we're seeing more successful strikes. So this is a time for optimism within the trade union movement, and certainly a good time to be joining them. Some unions, such as mine, Unite, have elected a new General Secretary who's more determined to fight some of these battles. And I'm quite optimistic about where we're going at the moment. Just one little thing, last thing, and that is a little bit about how unions organise and what you will meet and see when you join a union. Unions mostly organise through things called branches in local areas or in one factory where people in similar employment mostly can come together, normally meeting once a month, where they can consider the problems that they're facing. They can consider submitting proposals to the national union about policy. All the unions have very formally democratic structures, though they can be quite difficult to implement. But you do, as a member, have the right to go to a meeting, to take forward any proposals that you have, and for those to maybe submitted to a national conference of the union to change its policy on something. So that when you join a union, the first thing you'd meet or have the chance to do would be to join a branch, get to know other activists, and develop strategies for improving your situation. Workplaces have reps or shop stewards, which is something that you could consider taking on once you've got a little bit more confidence in your workplace, and certainly the union will provide training in all aspects of what you might need to do that. To finish on a high note then, I think this is a good time to be joining trade unions. There's a lot going on where people are fighting for their rights. There's campaigns developing around the cost of living and the price of energy, which are going up so dramatically at the moment. There are big campaigns with lots of union support to improve the health services. And there is a bit of a strike wave starting, certainly in Manchester, where people are realising that with inflation running at the high level that it's now running at, that without regular substantial pay rises, their wages will lose their value very quickly and very dramatically. One problem you will face, though, is there's a lot of people on no hours contracts at the moment. 0 hour contracts. It means you are very, very casual. This is going to be a big political battle for the trade union movement to make it illegal for people to be employed in these ways. And it's the kind of work that you could well end up working in. I hope that's been useful. You've seen me recorded, hopefully well translated, and I'll see you in a few minutes in the live bit of the meeting. Thanks a lot.